One does simply not paint a Boromir. For our mighty hero of Boromir today, we started by spraying him with some matte black paint, as he wears darker colour clothing when portrayed in the movies. So we shall follow suit. Now, for the main coat, we will go about this in a different way today, by applying a base colour and then using shades to alter the top surface in order to create a new colour. I will talk more about this when we get to the shade stage later. But for now, we want to just base coat all of the elements on the miniature first. When applying the base coats, you do not need to be too neat here, and if you do paint onto the black undercoat, then don't worry, as each part of the miniature needs to get painted anyway. So you can just go over this with the next colour. It's quicker to lay down the initial colours this way, which means more time for those little details towards the end. It's wise to do a couple of thin layers of paint here, just to ensure that there is good coverage without losing any of those details. A couple of browns will be needed next for the hair and the leathers. An oak brown paint makes a useful base coat for Boromir's long flowing locks and facial hair. But we can also use this colour for his belt and arm guard. Afterwards, we can switch over to a darker brown of mocha skin and apply this onto the boots, the sword scabbard, as well as the back of the shield. The inner part of the arm guard will have some details painted on later, so again a darker brown mocha skin paint was used for the base coat here too. And then the brighter details that we'll paint later on will be seen more clearly. The infamous Horn of Gondor was next, and the base coat for this is Banshee Brown. I will always remember the first time watching Fellowship of the Ring and the scene in Amon Hen, where Boromir's last stand of using the horn and then valiantly fending off the 𝗥𝗏𝗏 until his final breath. Such a sad but heroic scene. The same greedy gold from the horn was also used on the circular section on the boss of the shield. And then the rest of the metals were picked out with gun metal. This was the chainmail armour that Boromir is wearing under his clothing, his sword, and finally the metal sections of the shield itself. There are other smaller parts such as buckles and buttons on the miniature, but they were left until towards the end just for ease of picking them out. The last of the base coats was black, and this was to go over the gloves as well as the detail on the sword scabbard. And once completed, we can move on to shading, which is one of my personal favourite parts of painting miniatures. As mentioned earlier, Boromir's coat was going to be painted in a different manner today. Using a green shade, this was applied all over the grey base coat to alter the colour to a dullish green. A couple reasons why I chose to do this, rather than just base coating it green, was to show what can be done with a shade paint, rather than traditionally using it as a wash to create shades for a miniature. Secondly, I wanted a specific green colour that I did not have, and instead of mixing paints together, I might not be able to get a 100% colour match later down the line if I wanted to revisit Boromir by painting a different sculpt. Then I know by at least painting the base coat and then the wash, I will get the same result every time. So I know that this method will be fine and dandy for me and future Chris also. A red tone was thrown onto the cloth to make it more punchy looking and to give it more depth, as it flows into the recesses. But it wasn't used for the shield at this point. A few other tones were used to cover the rest of the areas, such as strong tone for all of the leathers, hair, wood and the back of the shield, flesh wash for the face in gold, and also a mid-brown for the horn. These were all painted on with the sole purpose of adding depth to the miniature and create those shadows that you see in real life. The nice thing with shade paints, also known as a wash, is the way that they work. They are much thinner than the normal acrylic paint range. This allows the liquid to flow into the recesses nicely, and you can have a more visually appealing miniature in no time. So with that being said, dark tone was next, and this is a great shade paint. And I would say that I use this on 99% of my miniatures that I paint. A layer of this shade was applied to the red and the green clothing as well as all of the metals. This paint is super for creating darker shadows in a matter of seconds. and I would say this is a must-have in anyone's painting arsenal, even if you have something similar in a different paint range, or you use oil paints for your shading. Which brings me to the question of the day. Do you use oil paints for miniature painting? Answers in the comments below. Now that Boromir is dry after being soaked in shade paints, we can move on to painting up those details and applying some highlights, so that he will be ready to say they have a cave troll. Firstly, Banshee Brown was reapplied onto the horn, but the shadows were left alone at this point, as we don't want to paint over these darker areas. And then a brighter colour of mummy robes was used afterwards. However, this time, thin lines were painted to create faint grooves, or striations, along the horn. As we will be painting a lot of small details and highlighting, we will jump over to a detail brush now. The eyes and teeth were picked out first, and they were done now because if you make a mistake, then it would be easy to fix at this point by applying a single layer of paint rather than multiple layers once the face is completely finished. But sometimes it's personal preference as to when they are painted, and sometimes even I do it at the end also. It just depends how much coffee I've had in the day already. The tree of Gondor was painted onto the tiny area at the bottom of the arm guard. This is a little bit tricky, but it came out well at the end. Don't worry, I will save all the tree puns for the end video. If you are not comfortable at small details, I would still suggest to have a go. The worst case is that you just paint it brown again if you go wrong. For Boromir's face, a thin layer of barbarian flesh was used to pick out the areas where the light would naturally fall. So the cheeks, the nose and the forehead here, leaving the darker areas alone once more. You could even pick out the lower lip too. Something that I introduced to my painting in recent years is to thin down a little bit of red or purple paint, and then applying this into the recesses of the face, including the lower section near the jawline. This I feel gives a nicer, more natural skin tone to a miniature. It gives you a little extra definition, especially around the nose and cheek areas. Once this layer is dry, then a highlight of kobold skin was added to pick out the nose, the brow, and just underneath the eyes. And for a small scale miniature like this, it is plenty enough detail for our Boromir today. The hair had a single highlight of Monster Brown applied. The tip of the brush was guided along the length of the hair, and a series of lines were painted to create some strands of hair also. If you end up getting any of this paint into the recesses, then fear not, just add some dark brown back in there to cover any mistakes. Afterwards, the outer section of the arm guard and belt were highlighted with a lighter brown of dirt splatter. All of the edges were painted at this point, as the belt is one of the more visually appealing objects at the front of the miniature. Whilst the paint was still on the palette, some of the wood on the back of the shield was also picked out. This will create a variation of wood colour and texture once finished. The highlights were followed up with Monster Brown afterwards, but this time only the top parts of the belt were highlighted. Same as before, with the paint still on the palette, some thinner lines were painted onto the back of the shield to create a grainy look to the wood. And with that, we have another visually interesting element on our miniature. Boromir's leather boots, sword scabbard and the darker part of his arm guard were given a highlight of fur brown. The latter was also given a further highlight of centaur skin. This pinky colour really makes the edges pop out and look crispy. Some extra details were also painted on the top of Boromir's arm guard. Here I just used the fur brown paint for the lines, and then a series of dots of centaur skin to embellish this even further. Just because, you know, details. The last of the small details before we move on to the cloth were the gloves and the thread on the scabbard. A couple highlights of darker grey necromancer cloak followed by wolf grey were used. The blue of the wolf grey stands out a little bit more than a normal grey, especially when there is red and green present on our miniature. For the gloves, you are looking at the knuckles and the finger joints here to paint. This colour combination is quite useful for black leather, and can be used on any type of miniature that you want to paint in the future. And now for the green overcoat. As this is quite a flat part to the model, but it is the majority of the miniature, we are going to create a subtle scratchy texture here to make this old sculpt a little bit more interesting. So by thinning down our next colour of 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 with some medium, we are going to create some diagonal lines on Boromir's coat. I would say do this all over once and let it dry to see if you would like to increase the intensity of this. For this video, the diagonal lines were painted on twice, in 2 different directions. I will link another useful video for painting textures on cloaks here if you want to check it out after this one for more ideas. The overcoat was then highlighted with our 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 paint afterwards, but this time we did not use our medium mix as we had before, as this is too thin. And then for the second highlight, some uniform grey was used, to keep the final colour quite neutral. Going for a brighter green here would have felt more like elven clothing to me, and I wanted the red cloth to stand out more over the green. Again, to make this overcoat more interesting, a series of lines were painted along with the highlights towards the bottom edge of the cloth, just to make it seem a bit more worn and used. By applying this thin grey highlight, it really starts to make the clothing look sharper to the eye. And this old sculpt is starting to look like one of my favourites from the plastic Fellowship set. So now let's move on to the red cloth. We want to intensify the red tones here a bit more and make them pop out. Again, like the green overcoat, some medium was used to thin down our paint, but this time it was used to layer up the outer parts of the folded cloth to make them brighter. These areas were painted over twice to the required result. The outcome gives a brighter top surface to the cloth and transitions nicely into the darker maroon areas in the recesses. The edges of the shield were also painted at this stage too, first with the dragon red and then followed up by centaur skin. This final lighter highlight was also used to add some small lines onto the shield to represent scratches and chips from all of those 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 that Boromir was fending off, until... And if you want to see an 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 painting guide, then let your voice be heard, or read, in the comments below. The final highlight for our red cloth was scar tissue, and this was used sparingly for the creases on the cloth. Again, this colour is quite a bright highlight, so this will make our cloth have a crisp look to it. And it is important to keep these highlights pretty thin. If they end up being too thick, then they will stand out like a cherry tomato would do for Denethor. The detail embroidered on Boromir's tunic sleeve will be simplified whilst we're painting. A, because I'm not some sort of painting wizard, and B, I make these videos so they can be followed along by people with all painting levels and skills. So I will draw the detail of what we're going to do on this piece of paper, as it will be easier to explain on a flat surface. Firstly, towards the edge of the sleeve, there will be 2 lines painted, the bottom one being thicker than the top one, and then a triangle to go through both of them in the middle. From here, a series of dots will be painted as evenly spaced as possible, and then the rest of the sleeve will be filled in with these dots also. Some thinly painted lines will be placed between the rows of the dots to mimic a threaded appearance. Hopefully, afterwards you should have something that looks like this. The last little bits on the miniature are the metals. The gold on the horn was given a layer of bright gold to make it more shiny before shining silver was applied as a final highlight. The sword and shield were highlighted also at this stage. A good method for these elements is to use the side of your brush as well as the tip. This will pick out the edges much easier and you can get them done faster. Don't forget those little buttons that I mentioned earlier. To get the rest of your Fellowship painted, then check out this playlist right here. And if you are fond of Middle Earth and want to see even more guides to help you, then please do like and subscribe. And don't forget to turn on your notifications for future videos. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep on hobbying.